In March 1943, a German soldier named Hans Schmidt wrote a letter to his wife in Munich. He described the weather in Russia. He mentioned that food was adequate. He asked about their daughter. Then he wrote one sentence. Just one. "I don't think we're going to win this war." Military censors intercepted the letter before it left the Eastern Front. They crossed out that single sentence with thick black ink. The rest of the letter was sent home. But that one sentence, that one moment of truth, was deleted. And it wasn't just Hans Schmidt's letter. It was millions of letters, 40 billion letters written by German soldiers during World War II. 40 billion. And military censors read every single one, searching for that one forbidden thing that soldiers kept trying to tell their families. The truth that Germany was losing, that the war was hopeless, that they wanted to come home. This is the story of the largest censorship operation in history, what it reveals about the Nazi regime's fear of its own people, and the one topic that terrified Hitler's government more than any military secret. Not troop movements, not tank positions, not battle plans, but doubt. The creeping, undeniable realization among millions of German soldiers that they were fighting a war they couldn't win. To understand the scale of this operation, we need to understand how important letters were to the German military. In World War I, letters from home had been sporadic, unreliable. Soldiers sometimes went months without hearing from their families. Morale collapsed. Men deserted. Units mutinied. The German High Command learned that lesson. They learned that soldiers who received regular letters from home fought better, stayed more loyal, were less likely to break. So when World War II started, the Wehrmacht, the German military, made mail delivery a priority. They established an elaborate postal system. Field post numbers, Feldpost for every unit, dedicated postal trains, postal workers attached to frontline divisions. Letters from home were delivered to soldiers even in the middle of combat operations. A soldier in Stalingrad in 1942 could receive a letter from his wife in Berlin within a week, sometimes days. It was remarkably efficient, and soldiers wrote back. They wrote constantly. According to German military postal records, captured after the war and now in Allied archives, Wehrmacht soldiers sent approximately 40 billion letters during the war. 40 billion. That's not an exaggeration. That's the official estimate from Postal Service statistics. Between 1939 and 1945, 40 billion pieces of mail flowing from the front lines back to Germany. An average of about 20 million letters per day at the war's peak. 20 million letters every single day. Think about what that means. Every German soldier writing home regularly. Some wrote weekly, some wrote daily. Letters to wives, to mothers, to children, to girlfriends, to siblings, to friends. Describing daily life, asking for news from home, maintaining connections across the vast distances of war. Those letters were lifelines. For soldiers, they were proof that home still existed, that there was something beyond the war to return to. For families, they were proof that their sons, husbands, fathers, brothers were still alive. But here's the thing. The Nazi government couldn't allow completely free communication. They needed to control what information flowed back to Germany. They needed to maintain morale on the home front. They couldn't allow soldiers to tell their families the truth about what was really happening at the front. So they created a censorship system. The largest, most comprehensive censorship operation in history. Every single letter written by a German soldier passed through military censors. Every single one. Postal censorship offices were established at every level of the military hierarchy. Company level, battalion level, regimental level, divisional level. Junior officers were assigned censorship duties. They'd receive bags of letters from their men. They'd read them, all of them, looking for prohibited information. And when they found something forbidden, They'd cross it out with black ink or cut it out with scissors before the letter was sent home. What kinds of things were forbidden? Initially, in 1939 and 1940, the prohibited topics were military information, troop movements, unit designations, locations, casualties, anything that could provide intelligence to the enemy if the letter was intercepted. That makes sense. That's normal wartime censorship. Every nation did it. But as the war dragged on, as Germany's situation deteriorated, the censorship expanded. It became less about protecting military secrets and more about protecting the regime from its own soldiers' despair. Let me tell you what military censors were specifically instructed to remove, according to censorship guidelines issued by the Wehrmacht High Command in 1942 and 1943. These guidelines were captured after the war. They're now in archives in Germany, Britain, and the United States, and they're revealing. Censors were told to remove any mention of doubts about victory, any suggestion that Germany might lose the war, any criticism of Hitler or Nazi leadership, any complaints about inadequate supplies, equipment, or leadership at any level, any descriptions of retreats or defeats, any mention of mass casualties, any discussion of Allied superiority in equipment or numbers, any expressions of war weariness or desire for the war to end, any religious or philosophical questioning of the war's purpose. Read that list again. The censors weren't just protecting military secrets. They were protecting the Nazi narrative. They were preventing German soldiers from telling their families the truth, that the war wasn't going well, that Germany was losing, that the propaganda was lies, that men were dying for nothing. And here's what's extraordinary. We know what was censored because some of these letters survived. Not the letters that were sent home, obviously those had the forbidden passages removed, but copies, drafts, and most importantly, censors' reports. Military postal censors were required to file reports on the morale reflected in letters they read. Those reports, thousands of them, survived the war. They're in archives now, and they tell us exactly what soldiers were trying to say, what was being removed, and what the Nazi leadership was so afraid of the German public learning. Let me read you some examples. These are from actual censors' reports, translated from German, now in the British Imperial War Museum archives. February 1943. Censors' report from the Eastern Front. Approximately 30% of letters examined this week contain expressions of doubt about the war's outcome. Common phrases removed include, "I don't see how we can win. We are outnumbered. When will this nightmare end? Morale is declining significantly." March 1943. Censors' report from North Africa. Soldiers are openly questioning why we are fighting in Africa when Germany itself may be threatened. Removed multiple references to superior British tank numbers and American equipment. Several letters express desire to return home, regardless of victory or defeat. November 1943, Censors' report from Italy. Expressions of war weariness are nearly universal. Censored numerous descriptions of retreats, which soldiers incorrectly identify as defeats. Removed all mention of Allied air superiority. Multiple letters contained religious questioning of the war's justification. All passages removed. You see the pattern. Soldiers were trying to tell their families the truth, that they were losing, that they were overwhelmed, that they wanted to come home, and the censors were systematically removing that truth, protecting the lie that Germany was winning, that the war was justified, that victory was inevitable. But here's what makes this story so powerful. Despite the censorship, the truth got through. Not in what soldiers wrote, but in what they didn't write. Families learned to read between the lines. If a letter arrived with multiple black marks or cut-out sections, that told you something. If your son stopped writing about advancing and started writing only about the weather and asking about life at home, that told you something. If his letters became shorter, less frequent, more guarded, that told you something. German civilians weren't stupid. They could figure out that the war wasn't going well, even if their soldiers couldn't say it directly. And many soldiers developed codes with their families, phrases that seemed innocent but carried hidden meanings. I'm looking forward to seeing the garden in spring might mean I don't think I'll survive the winter. The weather here is worse than expected might mean the battle situation is desperate. Tell father I remember his advice might mean I wish I'd never enlisted. Let me tell you about one soldier whose letters survived. His name was Lieutenant Werner Heinz, aged 24, from Stuttgart. He served on the Eastern Front from mid-1941 until his death in January 1943 at Stalingrad. His family preserved all his letters. After the war, they donated them to the German military archives. Those letters, over 200 of them, show the evolution of his thinking and the censors' increasing intervention. In July 1941, just after the invasion of the Soviet Union began, Werner wrote enthusiastically, "We are advancing rapidly. The enemy is in retreat. Victory seems certain. This will be over by winter. No censorship marks." The letter was sent as written. By October 1941, his tone changed slightly. "The fighting is harder than expected. The Russians are more determined than we were told. Winter is coming, and we're still far from Moscow." This letter has a few words crossed out. The censors removed specific casualty numbers Werner had mentioned. February 1942. "I don't know how much longer we can sustain this. We're exhausted. The cold is unbearable. We lost half our company last month." This letter is heavily censored. Multiple sentences crossed out. The censors removed his casualty figures, his description of frostbite cases, and his admission of exhaustion. August 1942. "Mother, I don't think I'm going to see home again. If something happens to me, tell Greta I loved her. I'm sorry I couldn't be the son you deserved." This letter has a censor's note attached. The note says, "Extreme pessimism. Letter not sent. Soldier to be counselled about appropriate content." That last letter was never sent. Werner's mother never received it. She didn't know that in August 1942, her son believed he was going to die. She received sanitized versions of his letters, versions that had been edited to remove his despair, his fear, his growing certainty that he wouldn't survive. Werner Heinz died in January 1943 during the Battle of Stalingrad. His last letter, written in December 1942, was found on his body when Soviet forces recovered German dead after the battle. The Soviets catalogued personal effects. That's how the letter survived. It was never sent. It reads, "I am in a basement in Stalingrad. There is no food, no ammunition, no hope of relief. They tell us to fight to the death. I think they mean it. I don't want to die here. I want to come home. Please forgive me." That letter, that cry for help, for understanding, for forgiveness, was never sent. The censors would have removed every word of truth from it. Werner's mother only learned the details of his death after the war, when the archives were opened and researchers found his unsent letters among Soviet-captured documents. His story is heartbreaking, but it's not unique. It's the story of millions of German soldiers who tried to tell their families the truth and were silenced by their own government. Now, let's talk about why the Nazi regime was so afraid of these letters. Why was doubt, specifically doubt, the one thing they couldn't allow soldiers to express? The answer is that the Nazis understood something fundamental about maintaining power. You can control people through propaganda as long as they believe the propaganda. But once doubt enters, once people start questioning the official narrative, control begins to slip. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, spent enormous resources maintaining the image that Germany was winning, that victory was inevitable, that sacrifice was temporary and necessary. Radio broadcasts proclaimed victories. Newspapers printed optimistic reports. Newsreels showed German tanks advancing. The message was constant. Germany is strong. Germany is winning. Victory is certain. But if soldiers on the front lines were writing home saying, actually, we're losing. We're outnumbered. We're retreating. The Russians have better tanks. The Americans have better equipment. This war is unwinnable. Then the entire propaganda structure would collapse. Because people would believe their sons and husbands over what the radio told them. Personal testimony trumps official propaganda every time. So the regime had to stop that personal testimony from reaching the home front. They had to maintain the illusion of success, of control, of inevitable victory, even as that illusion became harder and harder to sustain with each passing year of the war. By 1943, the censorship system was under enormous strain. The volume of pessimistic letters was overwhelming. Censors couldn't physically remove every expression of doubt from 20 million letters a day. So the system adapted. Censors focused on the most extreme cases. Letters expressing open defeatism. Letters directly criticizing Hitler. Letters describing specific catastrophes. Those were either heavily censored or simply not sent at all. Less extreme letters. Letters that merely hinted at difficulties or expressed homesickness without directly questioning victory. Those might get through with minor edits. The system triaged. They couldn't stop every truth from getting home, but they could stop the most dangerous truths, the ones that would completely shatter the propaganda narrative. And when censors found letters that were too defeatist, too pessimistic, too honest, they didn't just censor them. They reported the soldiers who wrote them. According to captured Gestapo records, soldiers whose letters showed extreme defeatism could be investigated for undermining military morale. That was a serious charge. It could result in demotion, transfer to a punishment battalion, even execution in extreme cases. So soldiers learned to self-censor. They learned what they could and couldn't say. They developed a kind of code language with their families. They became careful. But even with self-censorship, even with coded language, the truth kept trying to break through. Because the truth was undeniable. Germany was losing, and soldiers knew it. Let me tell you about the censors themselves, because this is an underexplored part of the story. Who were these people reading millions of letters? What did they think about what they were reading? Some insight comes from post-war interviews with former military censors, conducted by Allied intelligence and by historians in the decades after the war. One former censor, Hauptmann, which means captain, Friedrich Weber, gave an interview in 1978. He described his experience as a postal censor on the Eastern Front in 1942 and 1943. He said, "I hated the work. I was reading the private thoughts of men I commanded. I was seeing their fear, their despair, their loss of faith, and I was ordered to hide that from their families. I was ordered to perpetuate the lie that everything was fine, that we were winning, that their sacrifices mattered. But I knew the truth. I was reading it every day in letter after letter. We were losing, and I was part of the machinery that prevented the German people from knowing." Weber said that by late 1943, nearly half the letters he censored contained some expression of doubt or war weariness. Half. And his job was to erase that truth before it reached home. He said the psychological toll was significant. He was reading the last words of men who would soon be dead. Men who were trying to say goodbye, trying to express love, trying to confess doubts and fears. And he was crossing out their most honest words, their most human words because those words contradicted the official narrative. Weber wasn't alone in his misgivings. Other former censors have described similar experiences, but during the war, they had no choice. Refusing to perform censorship duties was insubordination. Allowing prohibited content to pass through was dereliction of duty, so they did their jobs, they read the letters, they wielded the black ink and the scissors, and they sent sanitized versions home, versions stripped of truth. Now, here's where the story takes a darker turn. As the war situation deteriorated in 1944 and 1945, the censorship system became increasingly draconian. The guidelines for what could be said in letters became more restrictive, and the penalties for violating those guidelines became harsher. In October 1944, after the failed attempt on Hitler's life in July, the Nazi regime became paranoid about internal dissent. New regulations were issued regarding military correspondence. Letters that expressed defeatism or undermined morale were now considered acts of sedition. Soldiers could be court-martialed. In some documented cases, soldiers were executed for writing letters deemed too pessimistic. The message was clear. You will maintain the fiction of confidence and loyalty. You will not express doubt. You will not acknowledge reality, or you will face consequences. And yet, the letters kept coming. Soldiers kept trying to tell the truth. Even knowing the risk, even knowing their letters would be censored, even knowing they could face punishment, they kept writing. Because they needed to. Because bottling up that truth, that despair, that growing certainty of doom was psychologically impossible for many of them. So they wrote, and the censors read, and the black ink flowed. Let me give you another example. This one from a collection of letters preserved in the German Federal Military Archives. Gefreiter, which means private first class, Otto Becker, age 32, from Hamburg. He served in Italy in 1944. His letters home to his wife show the evolution of the war through his eyes. April 1944. We are holding the line in Italy. The Americans and British are strong, but we are stronger. Victory is still possible. No censorship marks. July 1944. The Allies have landed in Normandy. Everyone here knows what that means, even if we can't say it. We are surrounded, heavily censored, multiple sentences removed. September 1944. Anna, I need you to know something. Whatever happens, I tried. I did my duty. But this war, this whole situation, the letter ends there. A censor's note says, remainder of letter too defeatist to send. Soldier counselled. December 1944. Otto Becker was killed in action. His last letter was never sent. It was found in his effects. It read, I don't think Germany can win. I don't think we ever could have. I'm sorry I believed the lies. I'm sorry I left you and the children for this. If I don't come home, tell them their father loved them, but was a fool. That letter was never sent because it told the truth. And the truth was the one thing the Nazi regime could not allow to reach the German home front. Now, let's talk about what happened when the censorship system finally collapsed. Because it did collapse. In the final months of the war, in early 1945, as Germany itself became a battlefield, the postal system broke down. Censorship became impossible. Letters from soldiers, uncensored letters, began reaching families, and those letters were devastating. German civilians suddenly read what their soldiers really thought, that the war was lost, that Hitler had led them to ruin, that the sacrifices had been for nothing, that the propaganda had been lies. The psychological impact was enormous. The myth of German invincibility, carefully maintained for 6 years through propaganda and censorship, shattered in a matter of weeks. Post-war surveys conducted by Allied occupation authorities in 1945 and 46 found that many German civilians cited letters from soldiers in the final months of the war as the moment they realized Germany had truly lost. Not the military defeats, not the Allied bombing, but the uncensored letters from their own family members at the front, telling them the truth that had been hidden for years. There's a bitter irony there. The Nazi regime spent 6 years and enormous resources censoring 40 billion letters, preventing soldiers from telling the truth, maintaining the illusion of victory. And in the end, when the censorship system collapsed, the truth came flooding out all at once. And it was worse than if they'd allowed honesty from the beginning. Because now it wasn't just, we're losing. It was, we've been losing for years and they lied to you. The betrayal was complete. Not just the military defeat, but the realization that the regime had deliberately deceived the German people, had prevented soldiers from telling their families the truth, had maintained a false narrative, even as millions died for a lost cause. Let me tell you about one final letter. This one is different. It's not from a soldier to his family. It's from a mother to her son. And it survived because it was found unsent in the woman's home after her death in 1945. Frau Margarete Schneider, age 53, from Berlin. Her son was a soldier on the Eastern Front. She wrote this letter in March 1945, but never sent it. It reads, "My dear boy, I know you cannot tell me the truth in your letters. I know they cross out what you really want to say, but I need you to know that I understand. I know the war is lost. I know you may not come home, and I need you to know that it's not your fault. You didn't start this war. You didn't ask for this. You were lied to, just like all of us. If you can, come home. Desert if you have to. I would rather have you alive and dishonored than dead and a hero. Please come home." She never sent that letter, because sending it could have gotten her arrested for undermining military morale, because it could have gotten her son arrested if censors intercepted it, because the truth, even a mother's desperate plea for her son's life, was too dangerous to put in writing. Margarete Schneider's son died in April 1945, 3 weeks before Germany surrendered. She died in May 1945 during the Battle of Berlin. The letter was found in her apartment by Soviet soldiers who were documenting civilian casualties. It was preserved in Soviet archives and only discovered by researchers in the 1990s. A mother who couldn't tell her son to save himself, a son who couldn't tell his mother he was dying for a lost cause. Both silenced by a regime that valued propaganda over human life. That's the real story of Wehrmacht letters. Not just the 40 billion letters sent, but the truths that were removed, the words that were censored, the reality that was systematically hidden. And the one thing censors deleted, the one forbidden truth that terrified the Nazi leadership, wasn't a military secret. It wasn't troop locations or tank numbers or battle plans. It was doubt. The simple, honest expression of doubt. The acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, Germany wasn't going to win. That maybe the war was lost. That maybe the sacrifices were in vain. That truth, that creeping realization, shared by millions of German soldiers, was the one thing the regime couldn't allow to reach the home front. Because once people doubted victory, once they questioned the narrative, the entire structure of Nazi control began to crumble. So they censored 40 billion letters. They crossed out the doubts. They removed the despair. They hid the truth. And in doing so, they prolonged a war that was already lost, condemned millions to die for a cause that was already doomed, and betrayed the trust of an entire nation that believed the lies they were told. The letters remain. Thousands of them in archives across the world, with their black ink marks and cutout sections. Physical evidence of a regime so afraid of the truth that they censored the private thoughts of dying men. So determined to maintain a lie that they prevented sons from telling their mothers they wanted to come home. 40 billion letters, and the one thing deleted from them wasn't military intelligence. It was hope. The hope that someone would finally tell the truth. The hope that honesty would end the madness. The hope that doubt, once expressed, might save lives. But the censors had orders, and the black ink flowed, and the truth was buried. Until the war ended, and the archives were opened, and historians could finally read what German soldiers really wanted to say. I don't think we're going to win this war. That was the forbidden sentence. That was the unacceptable truth. That was what terrified the Nazi regime more than any military secret, because they knew, even in 1943, even in 1942, that if the German people learned what their soldiers knew, if the truth reached home, the war would end, not through military defeat, but through the collapse of popular support, through the realization that the sacrifices were pointless, through the acknowledgement that the propaganda was lies. So they censored, they crossed out, they cut away, they hid the truth, and millions died while the lie was maintained. Remember that. The next time you read about propaganda, about censorship, about regimes that control information, remember the 40 billion letters. Remember the one forbidden truth. Remember that totalitarian governments don't fear military secrets being revealed. They fear their own people learning the truth. They fear doubt. They fear the simple, honest expression of reality. Because reality, once acknowledged, cannot be denied. Truth once spoken cannot be unspoken. Doubt, once expressed, spreads like wildfire, and regimes built on lies cannot survive the truth. That's what the censored letters teach us, not just about World War II, but about the power of truth and the desperate, futile efforts of tyrants to suppress it. 40 billion letters. And the one thing they couldn't say, I don't think we're going to win. But they knew. The soldiers knew, and eventually, despite the censors' best efforts, everyone knew. The truth always comes out. Eventually.